Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Charity Village webinar. We are going to get started in just a moment. We just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to join us before we begin the session. We have people joining us from across the country today, which is excellent. It's so nice to have all of you here. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's Charity Village webinar. My name is Mercedes and I'm the Marketing and Communications Specialist with Charity Village. As we are gathering here in a virtual platform, it is important to acknowledge that each of us is joining this webinar from the ancestral or unceded lands of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people. As a settler on this land, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Anishinaabeg, which includes the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation. For those who may be joining a Charity Village webinar for the first time, Charity Village is Canada's largest online job board for the nonprofit sector. In addition to our online job board, organizations can also post volunteer positions. So if you are looking for work or to recruit talent in the sector, Charity Village is a great place to start. We also have a ton of excellent resources for nonprofit professionals, including online courses, articles, fundraising tools, and free webinars like the one we are presenting today. Before we start today's webinar, I would like to quickly run through some housekeeping items. You may have noticed when you joined the webinar that you were automatically put on mute. Since we have hundreds of participants in today's session, it is important for us to minimize the amount of background noise so that everyone can clearly hear the presentation. But you can still ask questions and make comments using the question box at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. Look for that at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions as you think of them, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. You can also email your questions to webinars@charityvillage.com. If you happen to encounter any technical issues with the webinar, whether with viewing the presentation or with the audio, please let us know in the question box or by sending us an email. We will do our best to get any technical difficulties resolved as quickly as possible, but in a worst case scenario, please remember that we are recording today's webinar and we will send you the full recording by email tomorrow. So if you get called away or disconnected, you will still be able to view the full presentation. And with that, I would like to welcome our presenters for today, Jack Shand, Executive Partner of the Portage Group, and Jeff Thacker, Executive Partner of the Portage Group. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mercedes, and good afternoon, everyone. Jack and I are happy to join you today to deliver a webinar on the 2024 Canadian Nonprofit Sector Salary and Benefits Report. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to tell you a little bit about us, give an overview of the study and who participated, review some high-level compensation findings, provide some insights into how to use the data, and we'll wrap up with a discussion on the sector and compensation trends to help you make the case in today's environment. We will have a question and answer session at the end. So if you have questions while we're going through, please feel free to type them in the question area and we will address as many as we can at the end. The Portage Group is a full-service management consulting group focused on the distinct needs of the not-for-profit sector. Combined, our team has served over 300 associations, regulators, and charities in the areas of market research, strategic planning and organizational design, and executive recruiting. Our research team has conducted hundreds of projects, including over 40 compensation studies for organizations such as Charity Village and the Canadian Society of Association Executives. I am Jeff Thacker, Executive Partner of Research at the Portage Group and one of its founding partners. I have been conducting research for over 25 years, leading projects of all kinds. For the last 20 years, I have focused almost exclusively on associations and other nonprofits. And among the hundreds of projects I've conducted, I have led dozens of compensation studies, including all 9 of Charity Village's studies going back to 2011. Prior to working in the sector, I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers, playing a lead role in their measurement and market research practice. Over to you, Jack.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and good day to everyone. I'm Jack Shand. As you can see, I'm pleased to be part of today's webinar and to share some ideas on how you can put this information to use. My career has been in the nonprofit sector in two capacities. Like most of you, I've worked for nonprofits. More recently, in management consulting, I've had nonprofits of all types as clients. I've also been active over the years as a volunteer, ranging from board roles, chairing fundraising for regional and national charities, and in the education sector with a university's business school. So let's now get to why everyone's here, and that's to learn more about compensation in the sector. Back to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Jack. So just a quick overview of the study before we get into it. Data was collected through various channels in March and April of 2024, and in all, almost 1,300 organizations participated in the study. Each survey allowed respondents to provide compensation on and benefits information on an unlimited number of individual staff members grouped into 6 levels. And in all, there were 5,536 positions reported, and you can see the breakdown by level below. In some instances, respondents reported positions that covered groups of staff. So when we include all the groups, the study actually represents over 14,000 individual staff in the sector. Today's webinar is focused primarily on compensation. However, it is important to note that the study also covers the type and value of employment benefits offered in the sector. Some things to note about the study. So compensation figures are as of April 2024. Results are based on the survey responses and are only as accurate as the data provided by survey participants. The survey was conducted using Charity Village's subscriber list, webinar list, and social media recruitment. So it's not a random sample. And accordingly, the results may or may not be an accurate representation of the total nonprofit sector in Canada. And the findings in the study reflect the views of only those organizations that participated. Additionally, professional and trade associations and foundations were generally not included in the study so as not to skew the data. The overall results are very robust. However, some of the segments do have smaller sample sizes, so they should be interpreted with caution where appropriate. In terms of who participated in the study, we did have representation from across the country, with over half of the organizations being located in Ontario and about a fifth in BC. And there were a further 12% that were from Alberta. 7 in 10 organizations were registered charities, and a significant 4 in 10 respondents represent local organizations, while regional, national, and provincial organizations each account for just about a fifth of respondents. And the range of staff and budget size shown here is an indication that there was a good mix of organizations by size. Now, while many components make up the compensation package, by far the most common benchmark is cash compensation. And unlike other components of compensation, the value of cash compensation is easy to compare from one employee to another. Over the next few pages, I'm going to provide a high-level summary of cash compensation, and more detail and specific benchmark comparisons are available in the report. Let's start with a summary of cash compensation by level. So the teal bar represents the average base compensation, while the small sliver of orange represents the average bonus cash compensation. And not surprisingly, cash compensation generally increases with seniority. However, you will notice that the gap between level 1 chief executives and level 2 senior executives is not very big. And in fact, in many years, the level 2 average compensation is actually higher than level 1. And this is because, well, almost all organizations have a chief executive or executive director. Most are not large enough to also have the senior executive position. So subsequently, this position is more likely to only exist in larger organizations where pay at all levels tends to be higher. So in organizations where both positions do exist, the chief executive or executive director is almost always the higher paid of the two. So as seen here, in 2024, chief executives earn on average $117,700, of which $115,900 is in the form of base compensation. As mentioned, level 2 senior executives are only slightly lower than lower at an average of $113,900, followed by level 3 senior management at $95,400. After that, there's a significant drop off to level 4 at $72,000, and then non-management staff, which are at $52,000 to $54,000. Consistent with previous years, bonus cash does not represent a significant portion of compensation sector-wide. In fact, only 11% of participating organizations reported a formal incentive plan for at least one staff level. Chief executives are the most likely to receive bonuses with 14%, whether that's formal or otherwise. Followed by senior management at 11% and senior executives at 10% and management supervisory at 8%. Across all chief executives, including those who don't receive a bonus, the average compensation or the average incentive compensation amounts to 1.1% of base salary. However, if we look at only the 14% of chief executives that participate in an incentive plan, the average actually paid equals about 7.5% of base salary. Similarly, for senior executives, level 2, the average is 0.6% for the sector as a whole, but 6.1% among just those who receive a bonus. Senior management are similar. And for management, supervisory, and non-management, the sector-wide average, including those who do not receive any bonus compensation, is only 0.2% or less. And when we look at just those who receive bonuses, the average ranges from 1.9% to 3.0%. So how has compensation changed? Well, good news. From 2023 to 2024, the average compensation increased at all staff levels. The biggest gains over the previous 12 months were actually at the non-management levels. More specifically, the biggest increase was for support staff level 6 at almost 15%, followed by functional and program staff level 5 at 12.5%. Notably, these levels saw little growth or actually a decrease in the 2023 study. Among the top 2 management levels, average compensation grew by roughly 5% in 2024, while for the lower 2 levels of management, growth was at 2.5% to 3.2%. Now, notably, the change in average compensation at all levels met or significantly exceeded inflation, which sat at 2.6% between the studies. While people tend to focus on the most recent changes, it is important to look at the longer-term trend, which smooths out some of the study-to-study peaks and valleys. And over the last 11 years, since 2013, compensation has been rising at an average rate of 1.7% to 2.7% per year. Over the same time frame, the average inflation rate was 2.5%. So obviously, this means that the compensation growth rates over the last 11 years fall short of inflation for several levels. But as you know, inflation has been a bit of a roller coaster over the last few years, reaching a peak of 8.1% in June of 2022. So more specifically, inflation from April 2021 to April 2024 was 4.6% annually, compared to just 1.7% annually in the previous 8 years. So if we look more recently, since December 2020, which is 3 studies ago, to April 2024, inflation was up by a total of 15.7%. By comparison, the average management compensation is up over that period 13 to 18%, depending on level, while non-management compensation is up 17 to 20%. Let's take a closer look at how compensation in the not-for-profit sector compares with inflation. To assess this, we'll compare growth using a common index starting at 2013. So the thick black line represents inflation, and it shows that if you were paid $100 in 2013 and received raises equal to inflation, your pay would have increased to $130.90 by 2024 for a total gain of 30.9%. Let's add chief executives to the graph. And for chief executives who received an increase every year equal to the growth in the average benchmark from 2013, their compensation would have been generally increasing, generally in step with inflation up to about 2020, though there was a bit of a gap in 2018. And in the last 3 years, chief executive compensation has been playing catch up. And the trend line suggests that the increases were reactionary to the rapid inflation in 2021 and 2022, and that the gap is now essentially closed. So overall, average chief executive compensation is essentially on par with inflation in 2024. So for someone making $100,000 in 2013, they would be earning $130,300 in 2024. So that's only about $600 or 0.5% lower than if the increases had been based on inflation. We see a similar story for the other 2 senior management levels up to 2023, though for level 3 senior manager average compensation, it was consistently falling behind inflation from 2013 to 2020 before starting to really climb. However, neither of these levels experienced the same jump as the chief executives in 2024, and as a result, they are 6 to 10 points lower than inflation in 2024. Interestingly, the average compensation for level 4 supervisory, management supervisory has actually fared the best among the management levels and is sitting just above the pace of inflation in 2024. For non-management levels, support staff compensation was a little delayed, but did experience a rapid increase in 2024. To end up actually higher than any level in 2024 relative to inflation. Conversely, while level 5 experienced a significant increase in 2024 to play catch up, it is still well behind the pace of most levels. Now, we don't know what inflation is going to be like over the next 10 years, but if you do look back, you will see that from 1993 to 2020, inflation in Canada averaged only 1.7%. And the highest inflation in that point was only 2.9%, which was in 2011. So while obviously we had the spike in 2022 and there was a big gap with the wages, history does suggest that over the long run, not-for-profit compensation will generally experience market corrections to line up with inflation. So I want to take a look a little closer at the more recent volatile period using 2029 as the base year, which would be the benchmark right before the pandemic. Now, this allows us to better assess how the sector is adapting to the rapid changes in inflation in the past 5 years. And again, the thick black line represents inflation. It shows that if you were paid $100 in 2019 and received raises equal to inflation, your pay would have increased to $118.10 in 2024 for a total gain of 18.1%. Let's add chief executives to the graph again. And while we can see that the chief executive average compensation fell behind in 2022, they did catch up to inflation in 2023 and surpassed it in 2024. So from 2019 to 2024, the average chief executive compensation increased by 23.4% compared to 18.1% in inflation. Now, while we see a similar pattern, while the pattern to get there varies by level, levels 2 to 5 are close to inflation in 2024. With the two more senior levels actually being just below inflation and the two more junior levels actually being just above inflation. Now, support staff is an interesting case. Average compensation fell well behind inflation in 2022, and it remained stagnant in 2023. But in 2024, the catch-up was significant enough for support staff to actually outpace inflation in 2024 by almost 4 points. So in other words, current support staff compensation on average is 3.2% higher than if it had grown only at the rate of inflation. Now, it's important to note that changes in average compensation for the sector does not necessarily mean that individual employees are seeing those same changes. The change in the sector average reflects all the promotions and staff hirings and firings and other changes that may occur. So over the past 12 months, between 70 and 79% of staff, depending on level, report that they saw an increase in compensation. The one exception is chief executives, level 1, where only 61% saw an increase. And as you can see here, looking at the blue bar on the left, there's not a lot of variation in the average increase that was experienced across levels. It ranged from only 3.4% among support staff to 3.9% among senior executives. Now, it should be noted that the average sector change includes those that did not experience any change. Looking ahead to the next 12 months, increases are expected for 70 to 73% of staff, depending on level. Again, the exception being chief executives, where only 60% expect an increase. And the average increases in the coming 12 months were anticipated to be lower than what was experienced in the past 12 months at only 2.2 to 2.6%. Now, also shown here are the same results from the 2023 study for reference purposes. And at all levels, the average actual increase from the past 12 months, which is increase from the last study, which is the orange bars on the right graph. The one exception is level 5, where this year's average increase is on par with the average expectation from last year. Now let's look at how to use the data to create a salary range. The first step is to identify the applicable benchmarks for the organization and the staff profile. So we're going to use Jasmine. She is a chief executive of a registered charity based in Ottawa. And Jasmine and the board have agreed to undertake a compensation review, and she needs to gather information to help her and the board agree on a competitive compensation package going forward. Accordingly, she turns to the 2024 Canadian Nonprofit Sector Salary and Benefits Study. And as a first step, Jasmine creates a profile of her organization and herself. And in addition to what I've already mentioned, The scope of the charity is national. It's a mid-sized organization with 8 staff and an annual budget of approximately $1.5 million. The charity is not formally affiliated with any other organizations, and Jasmine has 8 years of experience in her discipline, and she holds a master's degree. So with her profile in hand, Jasmine turns to page 71 of the report to reference the detailed benchmarks for the chief executive position in registered charities. And Jasmine proceeds to identify all the benchmarks that match her profile, and there are 9 in all. Jasmine decides she should also look at the regional benchmarks. So on page 132, she finds the detailed table summarizing the benchmarks for the chief executive position in Ottawa. Again, Jasmine proceeds to identify the 9 applicable benchmarks for Ottawa. To make it easier to work with, Jasmine copies all the relevant data points to an Excel worksheet. And as a starting point, she decides to focus on only total cash compensation, knowing that that's the ultimate benchmark she wants to end up at, regardless of the structure of the compensation package. But looking at her summarized table, she does recall seeing something about quartile ranges in the report, and she wonders if the benchmarks line up, or the benchmarks identified line up with expectations. So to confirm the selected benchmarks are appropriate for her organization, Jasmine references the chief executive quartile ranges presented on page 69 of the report for registered charities and page 130 for the Ottawa market. Now, different organizations fit into different classes when it comes to compensation. The class an organization belongs to will depend on many factors, such as the profile of the organization, the constituents it serves, the type of work it does, the size, where it's located, etc. And organizations can generally be classified into 4 compensation groups or quartiles. And the quartile ranges divide respondents into 4 equal groups according to salary. So 25% in each group. And these quartile ranges should be used as a basic guideline to decide the caliber of employee that you wish to attract or retain. Accordingly, they can also be used to determine if the selected benchmarks and the final result line up with expectations. So based on her knowledge of her organization, her own profile, and her current compensation, Jasmine identifies that her organization is above average in the world of nonprofits, but it's not necessarily in the top group. In other words, Jasmine feels her organization probably fits in the 3rd quartile. And in comparing the registered charity benchmarks, she notes that all but 2 of the applicable benchmarks fall in the 3rd quartile for registered charities. And the ones that are outside, one is just above and one is just below the assessment, not by a wide margin. So based on this assessment, she decides that the registered charity benchmarks are a valid comparator for her organization. While registered charity benchmarks are important, Jasmine also knows that geographic markets play a significant role in determining compensation. Accordingly, she makes the same quartile comparison for the Ottawa market. And again, she notes that all but 3 of the Ottawa benchmarks fall in the 3rd quartile for Ottawa. And the 3 that are outside, again, they are just above and just below. So again, she is comfortable with the Ottawa benchmarks as a good comparator for her organization. So now that Jasmine has her benchmarks, she can determine the appropriate range for her position. Now, when setting a range based on the benchmarks, it's important to note there's no one correct way to do this. The data from the report is only a guideline to point you in the right direction and make decisions based on supporting data. Setting a range is part math and it's part judgment. And ultimately, you want to set a range that is competitive enough to attract and retain quality staff. In cases where you have an incumbent, it will be important to keep in mind the cost to replace that staff and the knowledge that you would lose. And in deciding on your final benchmarks, you should give the greatest weight to the comparables of closest fit. With that in mind, following are 3 possible approaches based on Jasmine's chosen benchmarks. And the latter 2 are really just a variation of the same approach. The first approach is simple and straightforward. You can identify the high value and the low value in your benchmarks. In this case, that's the national benchmark for Ottawa-based nonprofits is the high at $153,798. And the low is for registered charities with 6 to 10 staff at $97,899. Together, these would form your range, which when rounded is $97,900 to $153,800, with a midpoint of $125,850. Now, a slight variation to consider on this option, or any option for that matter, is dropping the original high and low value and going with the second highest and second lowest. Similar to scoring in judge sports, right? You drop the high and low. Now, typically, you would only do this when your high value or low value are significantly different than the rest of the range of benchmarks, or when you have a really wide range from the top to the bottom. Now, in Jasmine's situation, while not significantly outside the core range, the high and value are slightly gapped from the next closest values. Additionally, it is a very wide range at over $50,000. So Jasmine may want to consider this approach. And if Jasmine took this approach, the range would become $101,700, which is for registered charities with a budget of $1 to $2 million, to $142,500, which is national registered charities, and which would leave a midpoint of $122,100, which is just slightly lower than the original approach. Now, if you're going to drop the low, you should also drop the high. The second common approach is to take an average of all the benchmarks to establish a midpoint, and then to set a range using a percentage variation. So let's assume that the variation for the range will be plus or minus 10% from the midpoint. And we calculate the average of all the benchmarks, which is $124,400 after rounding. And next we calculate the 10% variance, which 10% of $124,400 is $12,400, again after rounding. And to get the range, we simply add this number to the midpoint to get the upper limit of $136,800 and subtract it from the midpoint to get the lower limit of $112,000. The third and final approach is similar to the second approach. The only difference is that instead of taking the average of all benchmarks together, we take the average of the major categories, so registered charities and Ottawa, and then we calculate the midpoint as the average of the major benchmarks. So again, we're going to use a 10% variance, and we take the average of the 2 categories, which is $116,675 for registered charities, and for Ottawa, it's $132,121. We take the average of those to give us the midpoint, which is $124,398, which just happens to be exactly the same as the previous method. Now, it's the same because we have the same number of benchmarks in each of the major categories. There's 6 in each. So you'll get the same result. However, if we'd had 6 benchmarks in one and 4 in the other, or 7 in one and 3 in the other, you would actually have different results. This is actually the approach that we use when we do custom analysis. And we use it because it allows you to give one weight to one factor over another where appropriate. Now, the ranges presented represent the published range, and typically an organization will hire qualified staff toward the midpoint of this range. The highest point in the range would potentially be earned by staff who are senior in the position and whose performance is consistently well above average. Jasmine's personal benchmarks, experience and education, would be used to determine where in the range she falls. Benefits, if offered, would be in addition to this. And at the chief executive level, benefits add an average of about $12,000 to the compensation package. Using the report, you can use the value of the benefits as a guideline and then determine the benefits that fit within the budget. Or, of course, you can add the value of benefits to the overall cash compensation. There's a lot of different benchmarks in the report to help you. We also do custom runs where we go back to the raw data to develop more precise benchmarks than what's available in the report. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack to tell you about how to build the case in 2025.
Thank you, Jeff. Our focus will now be on how to use the data in the Charity Village compensation report to build the case for compensation changes. I expect many of you are planning budgets and thinking about staff compensation for next year. I want to share an overview of the market we are in currently and information that could influence compensation decisions going forward. I'll be including some ideas that should help you to either grow your own remuneration and/or your potential to earn more in the future. The two observations on the slide were fair and accurate at the time, and this was our webinar a year ago. Let's take a deeper dive to see what's been happening over the past year. We were coming out of the post-pandemic era with inflation still relatively high, but predictions were inflation would be lower in 2024. However, consumer debt was high, and people with mortgages were facing much higher costs at renewal time. It meant people could have less to spend. Overall confidence about the economy and personal finances was circumspect at best. The Center for Future of Work had a warning about rising debt levels. That is a big sign of trouble in Canada's economy. There is a saying that debt is your future income used today. Deloitte Consulting said that this was a recipe for an economic slowdown leading into 2024. All of the major banks were accounting for significant bad debts leading into the current year. Today, the average individual has about $21,000 in debt, and that does not include their mortgage debt. For people in their prime earning years between the ages of 46 and 55, that debt load is even higher, 50% higher. If there's a sliver of good news, it's that the debt peaked last December and has edged slightly lower this year. We've also seen some improvement in housing costs in some cities. In the period 2022 through 2023, the average mortgage payment increased in Canada by 15%. This week, it was reported that about half of Canadians with mortgages have yet to see a renewal at higher rates. And even with the reduction in borrowing costs over the last year, those Canadians will see a significant increase in their mortgage payments in 2025 and beyond. As CBC reported last week, consumers are still struggling under the weight of a higher cost of living. It means two things. One, people need more money to keep pace. And two, absent significant income increases, people will take on more debt and will need to cut back. A year ago, major banks consistently predicted that inflation would ease, and they were correct. From 7% inflation a couple of summers ago, we were at 4% last year at this time, and now Canada is at 2% based on the most recent week update. The Bank of Canada now suggests we'll maintain this level for the rest of 2024, staying at or close to the desired 2% target for the next year. Once again, good news for borrowers. However, the governor of the Bank of Canada has raised a warning flag because of increasing trade protectionism, notably tariffs. Even without trade disputes and new tariffs, central banks are continuing to try and balance between rate cuts that are too fast or too slow. The prospect of a recession and inflation becoming too low remain for 2025 and beyond. The reality is that the Canadian economy is not robust, with growth at or about 1.3%. Despite a downward direction for inflation and interest rates, people are continuing to fall behind. They will be under pressure to spend less, and combined, it's a recipe for potentially a downturn in financial prospects for businesses and for charities in the year ahead. We had noted a year ago that unemployment was edging up. Excluding COVID peaks, the current unemployment rate is the highest since 2017. From 5.5% unemployment in late summer of 2023, CIBC correctly forecast an increase in unemployment to about 6% in early 2024. TD Bank's crystal ball looked as far as fall 2024 now, with its prediction of 6.5%. The current rate is 6.6%, and it continues to trend higher. Of course, higher unemployment means fewer jobs for people seeking work. One of the Royal Bank's senior economists confirmed recently that hiring demand from employers is slowing. Practically, it may mean for the prospect of moving to a new job for higher pay in 2025 could be more challenging. The strategy to move on to make more is still a good one, but there may be fewer opportunities in a tightening labor market. In summary, we have two factors. The data suggests employees will need to make up ground as they continue to struggle with debt. Employers are also aware of economic indicators and are unlikely to be more generous than the data suggests is necessary and prudent. This will be occurring in an economy that may have high unemployment and little growth. In the coming weeks, a number of human resource consulting companies will have completed research based on the salary increases employers are planning for 2025 and release their predictions publicly. You will all want to continue to monitor these reports as you develop budgets for your organization, although be mindful that many of these surveys focus primarily on business employers. As Jeff noted a few minutes ago, research for Charity Village indicates that for next year, salaries in the sector are expected to rise in the 2.3% to 2.6% range, depending on the level of the position. Consulting firm Normandin Beaudry has provided its preliminary estimate for 2025 based on its own employer survey, which is 3.4%, which is higher than the anticipated increase than we saw back in April amongst charities. Mercer also projects a 3.5 average increase next year, although cautions most budgets have not yet been approved. And we can see that a third firm, Gallagher Consulting, is in the same ballpark with a 3.5 forecast increase to salary budgets in Canada based on their research. So we have three credible sources to predict where salary budgets will be headed next year. The three are the inflation rate, the Charity Village research, and several major HR consulting firms based on their surveys of employers. Together, they give us a range from 2.3% to 3.5%. And we'll need to continue monitoring how economic performance affects our own organization's prospects. Today's webinar participants may be thinking about what they can do to demonstrate to their employer why an increase is justified, and possibly to justify an increase that's higher than the up to the maximum 3.5% average that's predicted. There are a number of steps we recommend to make the case, and I'm going to share 6 with you with a couple of bonus tips. Most of us understand the reasons to plan. They include focusing on what's most important and having a roadmap to achieve longer-term goals. A career plan is foundational, and it's essential to guide your career progression, including one measure of progress, which is your level of compensation. Armed with your career plan, you can better assess each year what the steps might be to take to keep your plan moving forward. For example, what was your salary goal for 2024 a few years ago? Or consider that if your employer offers no salary increase in 2025, will your career advancement be better realized by seeking employment elsewhere or seeking support for new training for an internal opportunity with your existing employer? The better supervisors will ask about your goals. So be ready, have a plan, share your goals. This will benefit you and your employer in considering the opportunities of mutual benefit to pursue. We all value our volunteers, and we know that they're committed to the best interests of our organizations. We also know they're busy. They likely don't have time to gather information on all aspects of their responsibilities. That's all true, also true for our supervisors. You can help by keeping them informed with reports, articles, and credible data. Sharing information such as an article link or the recording of this webinar can be helpful to the people in your organization who are making the decisions on budgets for next year. On the topic of performance reviews, I encourage you to maintain a record of what you've specifically done to add value. Where it's a positive financial result, all the better, as that could measurably demonstrate that the organization is financially better positioned to now reward an outstanding result. You need, without being boastful, to be your own advocate. It's always good advice to put yourself in the other person's situation. On compensation, they need the justification to pay you more. Help them find the money. Help them make the case. Having the discussion about your value in the marketplace is difficult without knowing what that value is. Fortunately, there are many places to find the information. Be certain to check job boards on a regular basis. Charity Village, of course, is one of the leaders. There are others by profession, such as accounting associations, and by function, such as event planning or government relations job sites. You can register for periodic job alerts with sites like LinkedIn to see what's available and what comparable jobs are paying. The Portage Group does a lot of executive search in the nonprofit sector, and all recruiters and HR firms are going to network to identify prospective candidates. Respond to their emails. Even if you don't have an interest in the job, people in my line of work want to know who's out there doing great work. And in having that conversation, you'll also hear about the job market and compensation benchmarks that will complement all of the other information you may have gathered. Finally, it's very important to understand your organization. Organization culture and other characteristics can influence compensation practices. If the people serving on your board are senior business leaders, for example, they may be more accustomed to paying more to retain good talent than would a volunteer board with no business experience. Jeff provided great detail on how to use the Charity Village report, so be sure to develop your budget proposals based on those relevant organizational and individual characteristics. The state of an organization is also a reality check. If the trend for your charity has been declining revenues, salary increases may be more challenging until that trend reverses. Also consider the sector you work in. Some sectors are predicted to have lower than average salary increases in 2025, such as healthcare. If higher salaries for staff translates to higher fees for the programs and services your charity or nonprofit delivers, your board may be especially conservative. I'll add a note regarding the theme of being realistic. Not every organization in one market is the same. As was noted in Jeff's remarks, if you're employed by a very small charity, compensation will be more influenced by factors such as size and complexity over just being in the same city or region. Money conversations can be emotional, and you always want to stay on brand as the consummate professional that you are. Keep in mind that your own personal situation is truly your own. If you have a monthly payment you can't afford, that's not relevant to your organization. Focus on organizational interests and making the case for your increase, which include retaining you, an exceptional performer. Finally, be judicious in the language you use. Stay cool and be objective. So you've followed the steps. You've prepared. You have a solid business case. You're armed with all of the supportive data. What happens when the salary request is denied? In brief, play the long game if the answer is no. Keep providing good data so decision makers know the gap they should be closing. Knowing why your ask was turned down may also be about your performance and not organizational realities. That's important to know too, so you can understand how to adjust course and earn that increase next year. The board may be open to considering other recommendations, such as doing a market study among similar charities that they will see as relevant comparators. Again, you can help them excel as a great employer. And when the answer is no to more salary, there are other alternatives. Non-monetary rewards are good strategies recommended for employees and for employers. All of these options may have benefit to career growth and/or your finances. Look to other benefits that, while they have a financial cost, they may be more affordable to the employer. An increase to pension or an education course where the cost is covered are examples. You might enjoy some time off. There may be opportunities for professional growth, job shadowing, time to volunteer. And with discussions about a possible move in the future to a 4-day work week, the trend to more time back in the office, even some more vacation, you may have a concession to negotiate that will bring you better work-life balance. I'll conclude before we move to questions with just a couple of tips. If you leave your organization and your role is an important one, so it must be replaced, consider what it costs your organization to lose you. Fees to an executive recruiter or placement agency can be in the tens of thousands of dollars. Even if your employer decides to hire without outside assistance, there are costs from advertising to competency training and the significant value of people's time to conduct interviews. There's the cost of lost momentum while your job sits vacant. Once your replacement is found, there's training time and learning time for them to get up to speed. The message: it costs dramatically less to retain good staff than to replace them. Even when unemployment rates are rising, every day on Charity Village, you can see there are plenty of great opportunities out there. If your career plan and career progress tell you it's time to move on for greener pastures, there's growth in a new challenge. Also consider there's no cost, other than a little bit of time, in testing the waters. The market will decide your value. We hope that today's webinar will give you a few tools to achieve your goals. Let's now turn to questions, and a reminder, you'll see that there is the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. We ask you to add your questions if you've not already done so, and I will turn it back to our hosts at Charity Village to facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Jack. So just to start off the Q&A session, we'll go with this question first. Were there any surprising findings in the 2024 data?
Well, thanks, Mercedes. So yeah, I think the thing that most stood out to me was actually the increases we actually saw for support staff level 6 and the management, or sorry, and the program and support staff, program staff. So level 6 support staff increased by 15%, and level 5 was 12.5%, which was far higher than all the other management levels, which that's not something we've typically seen through the years, and they had been lagging behind in 2023. So it was nice to see the big increases there.
Thank you very much. And then based on the data, did you notice a large number of organizations with 1 to 5 staff members?
Yeah, so I didn't really go into detail on it earlier in the presentation, but about 1/5 of the organizations are in that category of 1 to 5 staff, so 19%.
Thank you very much. And then can you please share any high-level observations about the differences in the data for registered charities versus other nonprofits?
So yeah, without giving away too much that's actually in the report, and because there is a write-up on that in the main report, generally speaking, the other nonprofits compensation tends to be higher, particularly at the chief executive level, and less so at the other 4 management levels. The differences, there don't tend to be differences at the functional program staff or the support staff. Now, anecdotally, what I can also say is, because we also do the study for associations is that association compensation, who are also nonprofits, but they're not in this study, do tend to be significantly higher than those of the registered charities.
Thank you very much. And then the last question, what are the advantages to salary positions for management positions versus hourly? Is one more common than the other for medium-sized nonprofit organizations or any sized organizations?
So across the board, salary is more common than hourly. We only put it in the report more so that you can calculate the difference between a full-time and a part-time position, because the hourly gives you a base to scale up or down. I don't have the number offhand, but if I had to take a guess, I'd say probably 75 to 80% of the compensation information that is reported across the board is in the form of a salary. The hourly wages would definitely be more common at the level 5 and 6, but again, salary is definitely dominant.
Thank you very much. And thank you for presenting such an informative webinar. Do you happen to have any final comments before we sign off today?
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to.
Oh, sorry, Jeff, you just cut off.
Oh, I would like to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to us today. We do the study every year, so it's always interesting to see the findings, and we get a lot of turnout for the webinars, and that's great to see. And I do hope that everybody who's listening on the webinar will participate in future studies so that we can continue to grow the base, especially in some of the smaller areas where we don't have as much representation outside Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec.
And I've enjoyed our time together. And should you have an interest in specific compensation information for your organization, please reach out to Jeff, my colleague. Of course, having the Charity Village report will be a very valuable resource to help you frame your recommendations for next year and support your board in its final budget decisions. And we'll hopefully all look forward to next year when we'll see what magnitude of increases have occurred in the sector, benefiting everyone that works so hard for important causes. And nothing would please us more if we see results that are perhaps higher than the early projections for 2025 suggest.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jack and Jeff. I just wanted to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the webinar recording. Please feel free to share this link with your colleagues. The email will also include a survey link that you can fill out with your feedback on today's webinar. You should see a survey link pop up right here in Zoom following the session as well. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for our next free webinar, Living Your Plan, Moving from Strategy to Action. You can find more information on this and all of our upcoming webinars at charityvillage.com/webinars. Thanks again for joining us. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.